The transport ship's engines hummed quietly as it approached Proxima Station, the most famous military academy in the galaxy. Inside the passenger compartment, a young alien sat nervously by the window, watching the massive space station grow larger and larger. This wasn't just any alien, though. Zix belonged to a peaceful insect-like species from a farming planet far away from the busy center of the galaxy. Zix had never seen anything like Proxima Station before. The academy was huge, with spinning sections and bright lights everywhere. Ships from dozens of different worlds were coming and going constantly. Some carried students, others brought supplies, and a few looked like they belonged to important government officials from various planets. The farming colony where Zix grew up was quiet and simple. Everyone worked together to grow crops and take care of their families. There were no soldiers, no weapons, and certainly no talk of battles or wars. But Zix had always dreamed of something bigger. When the opportunity came to apply for the Galactic Military Academy, everyone back home thought it was crazy. Why would someone from their peaceful world want to study warfare? But Zix had a different vision. Maybe someone who understood peace could help make wars less terrible. Maybe there was a way to use military knowledge to protect people instead of hurting them. It was a big dream for someone who had never even seen a real weapon before. Walking through the academy's corridors for the first time was overwhelming. Students from all over the galaxy filled the hallways. There were tall, blue-skinned beings with extra arms, short, furry creatures with big eyes, and reptilian students with scales that changed colors based on their mood. Everyone seemed confident and strong, like they belonged there.
Guys.
Zix felt very small and out of place. The dormitory room was basic but clean. Zix's roommate was a friendly rock-like being who didn't talk much, but helped explain how things worked at the academy. The first few days were spent getting used to the schedule, finding classrooms, and trying not to get lost in the enormous station. Then came the morning that would change everything. Zix walked into Professor Keth's classroom, carrying a bag, full of note-taking supplies and trying to look more confident than they felt. The professor was an old reptilian with scars across his face and arms, clearly someone who had seen real combat. His voice was deep and commanding, the kind that made everyone pay attention whether they wanted to or not. The classroom was set up like a theater, with rows of seats facing a large projection area. Students from different species sat together, chattering in various languages, until the professor called for silence. Zix found a seat in the middle row, not too close to seem eager, not too far back to seem uninterested. Professor Keth stood at the front and looked around the room slowly, his yellow eyes studying each student. When he spoke, his words were clear and serious. He explained that this semester would be different from others. Instead of learning about space battles between advanced civilizations, they would study something more unusual. They would examine the military abilities of species that hadn't yet developed space travel. This was important, the professor explained, because the galaxy was always discovering new worlds with intelligent life. Some of these species might become allies, others might become threats. Understanding how they fought, how they thought about conflict, and what motivated them could mean the difference between peaceful contact and terrible wars. The students murmured with interest. Most of them came from advanced civilizations with energy weapons, force fields, and spacecraft that could cross the galaxy in days. The idea of studying primitive warfare seemed almost amusing to some of them. That's when the door to the classroom opened, and everything changed. A human walked in, looking slightly embarrassed about being late. He wasn't particularly tall or short, didn't have any unusual features like extra limbs or colorful skin, and wore the same standard academy uniform as everyone else. He quickly scanned the room for an empty seat and spotted one next to Zix. The human slipped into the seat quietly, nodding politely to Zix and whispering a quick apology for the distraction. His name, Zix learned later, was Alex Chen. He seemed nice enough, though very quiet compared to some of the other students who loved to talk about their home worlds and their families' military traditions. Professor Keth didn't seem bothered by the interruption, continued his explanation about primitive species, then did something that made the whole room go silent. He dimmed the lights and activated the holographic display system. the air above. The students' heads suddenly filled with images and sounds from another world. It was a planet covered in blue oceans and green and brown land masses, with white clouds swirling through its atmosphere. The professor's voice cut through the amazed whispers of the students. This world was called Earth, he explained, and it was home to a species that called themselves humans. They had not yet developed faster-than-light travel, but they had been observed and studied from a distance for many years. What made them particularly interesting was their approach to warfare and conflict. The holographic display began showing scenes that made many students gasp in surprise. Humans in various time periods, using different weapons and tactics, engaged in conflicts across their planet. Some fought with simple tools made of metal and wood. Others used more advanced projectile weapons and mechanical vehicles. But what struck Zix most was how adaptable these humans seemed to be. They fought in frozen wastelands and burning deserts, in dense forests and open plains. They worked together in small groups and massive armies. They showed creativity in solving problems and remarkable determination even when facing impossible odds. Alex sat very still during the presentation, taking notes like everyone else. But Zix noticed something odd about the way he watched the footage. While other students reacted with surprise or excitement at particularly impressive human tactics, Alex remained calm and focused, as if he was studying something familiar rather than foreign. The professor pointed out specific examples of human ingenuity. He showed how they used their environment as a weapon, how they adapted when their original plans failed, and how they seemed to understand that warfare wasn't just about strength, but also about thinking ahead and working together. One clip showed human soldiers moving through a ruined city, communicating with hand signals and covering each other as they advanced. Their movements were smooth and coordinated, like they had practiced together countless times. Another clip showed a small group using simple tools to overcome a much larger force through clever planning and perfect timing. As the class period continued, Zix found themselves genuinely impressed by these humans. They weren't the strongest or fastest species, and their technology was far behind what most galactic civilizations had achieved thousands of years ago. But they had something else, something harder to define. They had a way of refusing to give up, finding solutions when everything seemed hopeless. When the lights came back on, Professor Keth assigned homework for the next class. Students were to research human military history and come prepared to discuss what they had learned. As everyone gathered their belongings and started filing out of the classroom, Zix noticed that Alex was still sitting quietly, staring at the empty space where the holograms had been. Walking back to the dormitory, Zix couldn't stop thinking about what they had seen. These humans were fascinating, and studying them was going to be much more interesting than they had expected. They also couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unusual about their new human classmate, though they couldn't quite figure out what it was. That evening, while researching human history in the Academy's vast digital library, Zix discovered that humans had been fighting wars for thousands of years. They had developed incredibly sophisticated strategies and technologies, all while remaining confined to their single planet. It was both impressive and somewhat sad to think about. As Zix prepared for sleep that night, they looked forward to learning more about these remarkable humans. They had no idea that their quiet classmate sitting next to them held secrets that would soon turn their understanding of everything upside down. 3 weeks had passed since that first class about humans. Zix was becoming more fascinated with Earth's inhabitants every day. Professor Keth continued showing different periods of human history, and each lesson revealed something new and surprising about these remarkable beings. The professor seemed to enjoy shocking his students with human adaptability. One day he showed ancient warriors fighting with swords and shields, working together in formations that looked like moving walls of metal. The next day, he displayed more recent conflicts where humans used flying machines and long-range weapons that could hit targets from incredible distances. What amazed Zix most was how quickly humans learned and changed their methods. When one strategy stopped working, they would develop something completely different. When they faced a new type of enemy, they would study their weaknesses and find ways to exploit them. It was like watching a species that refused to accept defeat, no matter how impossible the situation seemed. Alex continued sitting next to Zix in every class. always polite and helpful when Zix had questions about the homework or needed help, understanding some of the more complex tactical concepts. He was a good study partner, patient and knowledgeable, though he rarely volunteered answers during class discussions. When he did speak, his insights were always surprisingly detailed and accurate. During one particularly intense lesson, Professor Keth announced that they would be studying what he called elite human operations. The lights dimmed in the holographic display filled with footage that was different from anything they had seen before. Instead of large armies fighting on battlefields, these clips showed small groups of humans working in darkness, moving through dangerous areas with incredible precision. The quality of these recordings was much better than the historical footage they had seen earlier. Zix could make out individual faces, watch specific movements, and see exactly how these elite humans operated. They moved like shadows, appearing and disappearing so quickly that it was sometimes hard to follow their actions. One sequence showed a team of humans infiltrating what looked like an enemy compound. They communicated without speaking, using hand signals that seemed to convey complex information instantly. Each person knew exactly what to do and when to do it, like they were parts of a single, perfectly coordinated machine. Zix found themselves leaning forward in their seat, completely absorbed by what they were seeing. These weren't just soldiers, following orders. These were artists of warfare, individuals who had mastered their craft to an almost impossible degree. The way they moved, the way they anticipated problems before they happened, the way they seemed to think several steps ahead of their opponents, was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. That's when Zix noticed something strange. In one of the night vision clips, a single figure was moving through a building, checking each room methodically. The person's face was hidden behind tactical gear, but there was something familiar about the way they moved. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice unless you were really paying attention. But this individual had a distinctive way of pausing before entering each room, a specific method of checking corners, and a habit of adjusting their equipment in a particular pattern. Zix glanced over at Alex, who was watching the footage with the same focused expression he always wore during these presentations. But as Zix looked more carefully, they noticed something that made their breathing quicken. Alex was sitting very still, almost too still, like someone trying very hard to appear normal. His hands were perfectly positioned on his desk, his posture was completely controlled, and his eyes never left the display. But it was more than that. As the figure on screen moved through the building, Alex's shoulders tensed slightly, as if he was remembering something. When the operative on screen paused to listen for danger, Alex unconsciously tilted his head the same way. When the figure adjusted their gear, Alex's left hand moved almost imperceptibly, like he was fighting the urge to make the same adjustment. The resemblance was so subtle that anyone else would have missed it entirely. But Zix had been sitting next to Alex for weeks now, observing his mannerisms and getting used to his habits. They had noticed that Alex had a way of scanning rooms when he entered them, always checking exits and potential hiding places. They had seen him unconsciously evaluate other students, noting who might be a threat and who seemed harmless. They had watched him move through crowds with an efficiency that seemed natural but was actually carefully calculated. Professor Keth paused the footage and began explaining the tactical significance of what they had just witnessed. He talked about how these elite humans represented the peak of their species' military evolution. Individuals who had been trained from a young age to operate in the most dangerous situations imaginable. As the professor spoke, another clip began playing. This one showed a different mission, but Zix immediately recognized the same movement patterns, the same distinctive habits, the same almost supernatural awareness of surroundings. The operative's face was still hidden, but their body language was unmistakable. Zix's hearts were beating so fast, they were afraid other students might hear them. They tried to convince themselves that they were imagining things, that the resemblance was just a coincidence. After all, what were the chances that their quiet, friendly classmate was actually one of the elite warriors they were studying? But as more footage played, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Every clip seemed to feature the same individual, and every movement reinforced Zix's growing certainty about Alex's true identity. The way he held his shoulders, the rhythm of his breathing, even the way he unconsciously favored his left side when turning, it all matched. What they were seeing on the holographic display, the most convincing evidence came during a sequence that showed the operative's hands in detail. Zix had noticed that Alex had several small scars across his knuckles, faint marks that could have come from training accidents or equipment handling. In the footage, when the operative removed their gloves for a moment, Zix could see identical scars in exactly the same places. Alex continued taking notes as if nothing unusual was happening. But Zix could see the tension in his jaw, the careful control of his breathing, the way his handwriting had become more rigid and mechanical. He was working very hard to appear normal, but someone who knew what to look for could see the effort it was taking. When the class ended and students began gathering their belongings, Zix sat frozen in their seat, trying to process what they had discovered. Alex stood up calmly, packed his supplies with the same careful movements they had been studying on screen, headed toward the door like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Zix was no longer sitting next to a fellow student who happened to be human. They were sitting next to someone who appeared in classified military footage. Someone who had apparently accomplished missions that seemed impossible. Someone whose true identity was hidden behind the simple facade of an academy student. Walking back to the dormitory that afternoon, Zix's mind was racing with questions. Why was Alex at the academy? Did the professors know who he really was? Was he gathering intelligence on other species? Or was he genuinely trying to learn something new? And most importantly, what was Zix supposed to do with this information? That night, Zix lay in their sleeping alcove, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of everything. Their peaceful farming colony had never prepared them for anything like this. They had come to the academy to learn about conflict resolution and peacekeeping, not to discover that their study partner was apparently one of the most skilled warriors in the galaxy. The strangest part was that Alex had been nothing but kind and helpful. He had shared his food, helped with difficult assignments, and never shown any signs of being dangerous or deceptive. If Zix hadn't seen the footage, they would never have suspected anything unusual about their human classmate. But now they knew, and that knowledge felt like a heavy weight on their chest. Tomorrow, they would have to sit next to Alex again, pretend that nothing had changed, and somehow figure out what to do with the most shocking discovery of their life. The next few days were torture for Zix. Every time they looked at Alex, they saw something different. What had once seemed like normal student behavior now appeared carefully calculated. The way Alex chose his seat, always with a clear view of both entrances to any room. How he unconsciously positioned himself so he could move quickly if needed. The way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. Even during casual conversations, it was like seeing someone wearing a mask that had suddenly become transparent. Alex was still the same helpful, quiet person he had always been. But now Zix could see the careful control behind every gesture, the professional awareness hidden beneath his friendly exterior. During their next military tactics class, Professor Keth announced they would be analyzing advanced human combat scenarios. Zix felt their stomach drop as the lights dimmed once again. They weren't sure they could handle watching more footage while sitting next to someone who might actually be in it. The holographic display filled with scenes that were even more intense than before. These weren't historical battles or even the elite operations they had studied previously. These were real-time missions, apparently recorded during actual conflicts happening on Earth right now. The quality was so clear that Zix could see individual expressions on the humans' faces. Alex sat perfectly still beside them, his breathing so controlled it was barely noticeable. His hands rested flat on his desk, and he stared straight ahead at the display without blinking. To anyone else, he might have looked completely normal, but Zix could sense the tension radiating from him like heat from a fire. The first clip showed a hostage rescue operation in what looked like a large building complex. A small team of humans moved through the structure with impossible precision, neutralizing threats and locating civilians who needed help. One figure in particular caught Zix's attention immediately. Even through the tactical gear and electronic equipment, They recognized the distinctive movement patterns they had been studying. But this time, something went wrong during the mission. The team encountered unexpected resistance, and their careful plan fell apart within seconds. Most soldiers might have panicked or retreated, but these humans adapted instantly. They changed their strategy on the spot, improvised new approaches, and turned what should have been a disaster into a successful rescue. The individual Zix had been watching performed actions that seemed almost impossible. They moved through the building like they could see through walls, anticipating enemy positions and avoiding traps that would have caught anyone else. When teammates were in danger, this person appeared from nowhere to help them, then vanished again before anyone could track their movements. Zix glanced at Alex and saw something that confirmed their worst fears. There were tears in his eyes. Not the kind of tears that come from sadness, but the kind that appear when someone is trying very hard not to show emotion. Alex was watching himself on that display, reliving memories that were clearly painful and difficult. Professor Keth paused the footage and began explaining the tactical significance of what they had witnessed. He talked about split-second decision, making adaptive strategy, and the kind of training that would be required to perform at such a level. He mentioned that intelligence sources suggested this particular operative had completed over 200 successful missions without a single failure. As the professor spoke, Alex's hands slowly curled into fists on his desk. The movement was so subtle that probably no one else noticed, but Zix saw it clearly. They also saw the way Alex's jaw tightened when the professor described the psychological testing that elite operatives had to undergo, and how his breathing changed when the discussion turned to the personal cost of such intensive military service. When class ended, most students left quickly, eager to discuss what they had seen. But Alex remained in his seat, staring at the empty space where the holographic display had been. Zix gathered their supplies slowly, unsure whether to leave or stay. Finally, they worked up the courage to speak. It was incredible footage, Zix said carefully, trying to keep their voice casual. Those humans showed remarkable adaptability under pressure. Alex turned to look at them, and for just a moment, Zix saw something different in his eyes, not the friendly student expression they were used to, but something harder and more distant. It was like looking at the person from the footage instead of their classmate. Yes, Alex replied slowly. Humans can be very resourceful when they need to be. Survival instincts mostly. But there was something in the way he said it that made Zix's skin crawl. It wasn't the voice of someone discussing an academic subject. It was the voice of someone who had lived through experiences that most beings couldn't even imagine. Over the next few classes, Zix became increasingly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Professor Keth seemed to have access to an unlimited supply of classified human military footage, and each session revealed new examples of tactical brilliance and strategic thinking that defied explanation. The worst part was watching Alex during these presentations. He developed a habit of sitting perfectly still, barely breathing, his eyes fixed on the display, like he was hypnotized. Occasionally, Zix would see his lips move slightly, as if he was remembering conversations or commands from the missions they were watching. During one particularly intense sequence, showing urban warfare tactics, Alex suddenly stood up and left the classroom without explanation. Professor Keth barely paused his lecture, but Zix noticed several other students looking confused by the sudden departure. When Alex returned 20 minutes later, he looked pale and shaken, though he tried to hide it. That afternoon, Zix made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going directly to their dormitory after classes, they followed Alex at a distance, staying far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to observe where he went. Alex walked through the academy's corridors with the same purposeful movement they had studied in the footage, checking reflections in windows to see if anyone was following him. Fortunately, Zix's insectoid physiology allowed them to move very quietly, and they managed to track Alex to one of the academy's observation decks. The observation deck was a quiet area, where students often came to think or study while looking out at the stars. Alex stood alone at the large viewing window, his hands pressed against the transparent surface, staring out at the darkness of space. Even from a distance, Zix could see that he was struggling with something internal, some kind of conflict that was tearing him apart. For several minutes, neither of them moved. Alex continued staring at the stars, while Zix remained hidden behind a support column, trying to decide what to do next. The evidence was overwhelming now. Their quiet, helpful classmate was definitely the elite operative they had been studying. In class? But what did that mean? Was Alex dangerous? Was he spying on the academy? Or was there something else going on that Zix didn't understand? Finally, Alex spoke without turning around. "I know you're there," he said quietly. "You've been watching me during the footage presentations. You figured it out, haven't you?" Zix felt their breathing stopped completely. They had been so careful, so subtle in their observations. How had Alex known they were suspicious? They remembered the level of awareness they had witnessed in the combat footage. Someone with that kind of training would notice things that normal people would miss. Slowly, Zix stepped out from behind the column and walked toward the viewing window. Alex still didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed slightly as footsteps approached. "The person in those recordings," Zix said carefully, "it's you." It wasn't a question. They both knew the truth now. The only remaining question was what happened next, and whether their friendship could survive this revelation. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few seconds. Alex finally turned around slowly, and when Zix saw his face, they realized just how much their human classmate had been hiding. The friendly, relaxed expression was completely gone, replaced by something much more serious and guarded. "How long have you known?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zix's mandibles clicked nervously, a habit from their homeworld. That happened whenever they felt scared or uncertain, since the third week of classes. "Maybe earlier, but I wasn't sure until I saw the footage from the building rescue mission. Your movements, the way you check corners, even the scars on your hands, everything matched." Alex looked down at his hands, as if seeing the scars for the first time. "I thought I was being careful. I've been trying so hard to act normal, to fit in like any other student, but I guess some things are impossible to hide completely." The observation deck felt very quiet around them. Most students were in their dormitories by now, studying or socializing with friends. The stars outside the viewing window seemed brighter than usual, casting strange shadows across both their faces. "Why are you here?" Zix asked, the question they had been wondering about for weeks finally escaping. "Why are you at an academy where they're studying your own people? Where they're analyzing your own missions and treating them like academic exercises?" Alex was quiet for a long moment, looking back out at the stars. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tired, like he had been carrying a heavy weight for too long. "Because I'm tired," he said simply. "Tired of being the person in those recordings. Tired of missions that never end, of problems that can only be solved with force, of a world where the only solution to conflict is more conflict." He paused, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that looked completely normal but somehow different now that Zix knew the truth about him. "Do you know what it's like to be really good at something that you hate?" Alex continued. "To have a skill that everyone needs but that slowly destroys pieces of your soul every time you use it? I've completed hundreds of missions, saved thousands of lives, prevented wars that could have killed millions of people, and I hate every second of it." Zix felt something shift inside their chest, a feeling they didn't quite recognize. It might have been sympathy or fear, or maybe just confusion about how someone could be so skilled at something they didn't want to do. "But the footage we saw," Zix said carefully, "you were helping people. Rescuing hostages, stopping dangerous situations. Isn't that good work?" Alex's laugh was short and bitter. "Yes, it's good work, and someone has to do it. But every mission creates new problems, new enemies, new reasons for more missions. It's like trying to empty an ocean with a bucket. No matter how much you take out, there's always more water." Turned to face Zix directly, and for the first time since they had met, Alex looked completely honest and open. There was no mask, no careful control, just exhaustion, and something that might have been hope. "I came here because I wanted to learn how other species handle conflict," Alex explained. "I wanted to see if there were alternatives to the way humans approach problems. Maybe there's a better path, something that doesn't require people like me to exist. Zix realized they had been holding their breath and forced themselves to breathe normally. And what have you learned so far? That most species in the galaxy are just as violent as humans. They just have better technology to do it with, Alex said with a sad smile. But also that some species, like yours, have found ways to resolve conflicts without anyone getting hurt. That gives me hope that maybe humans can learn to do the same thing. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the observation deck. Zix was nervous about being discovered having this conversation, while Alex seemed to automatically assess whether the approaching person might be a threat. A maintenance worker passed by without looking in their direction. They both relaxed slightly, but the interruption had reminded them both of something important. "Are you going to report me to the Academy administration?" Alex asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer might be complicated. Zix had been dreading this question since they first realized the truth. It would be the logical thing to do. Alex was clearly here under false pretenses, hiding his true identity and possibly gathering intelligence on other species. Any responsible student would inform the authorities immediately, but looking at Alex, now seeing the genuine exhaustion and hope in his eyes, Zix couldn't imagine him as a threat to anyone at the Academy. He had spent weeks being nothing but kind and helpful. He had patiently explained difficult concepts when Zix fell behind in their tactical studies. He had even helped defend some of the smaller students when they were being bullied by more aggressive species. "I don't know," Zix admitted honestly. "Part of me thinks I should. We're here under a false identity, hiding who you really are. The Academy has a right to know if one of their students isn't who they claim to be." Alex nodded, accepting this reasoning. "That's fair. I understand if you feel like you have to turn me in. But," Zix continued, "the other part of me keeps thinking about why you're really here. If you're telling the truth about wanting to find better ways to handle conflict, then maybe keeping you here is more important than following the rules." They stood in silence again, both of them processing the weight of this decision. "How did you even get accepted to the Academy? Don't they do background checks? Verify identities? That sort of thing?" Alex's expression became slightly uncomfortable. The identity of Alex Chen is completely legitimate. He's a real person from Earth who applied to the Academy and was accepted based on his academic qualifications. The only problem is that Alex Chen died in an accident 3 years ago. No one in the Galactic Administration System was informed. Zix felt a chill run down their spine. "So you stole a dead person's identity?" "I assumed it," Alex corrected gently. Alex was a brilliant student who would have made an excellent cadet if he had lived. "I'm trying to honor his memory by using his opportunity to learn something that might help both our species." The justification sounded reasonable, but it also highlighted just how carefully Alex had planned this deception. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, but a calculated strategy that had required months of preparation and considerable risk. "What happens now?" Zix asked, though they weren't sure if they were asking about Alex's future at the Academy or about their own decision regarding what to do with this information. Alex looked back out at the stars, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but determined. "Now I finish what I came here to do. I learn everything I can about how different species approach conflict resolution. And when I'm done, I go back to Earth and try to teach my people that there might be a better way." Turn back to Zix with a slight smile. "And you decide whether you trust me enough to let me try." The weight of that decision settled on Zix's shoulders like a heavy blanket. They were being asked to become an accomplice to deception, but also possibly a partner in something that could change the future of human civilization. Standing there on the observation deck, with the stars as their only witnesses, Zix realized that their simple dream of learning about peacekeeping had suddenly become much more complicated, much more important than they had ever imagined. The following weeks changed everything between Zix and Alex, though neither of them talked openly about their conversation on the observation deck. Instead, their friendship deepened in subtle ways that only they could understand. During classes, when Professor Keth showed particularly intense combat footage, Zix would quietly slide their notes closer to Alex, giving him something to focus on besides the painful memories playing out on the holographic display. In return, Alex began sharing stories about his real experiences, though he was careful never to mention specific locations or classified details. He told Zix about the weight of making life-and-death decisions in seconds, about the friends he had lost during dangerous missions, and about the sleepless nights when success felt more like failure, because violence had been the only solution. But he also shared something more hopeful. He talked about the moments during missions when he had found ways to resolve conflicts without anyone getting hurt, when talking and understanding had worked better than weapons. These stories were rare, but they revealed why Alex had come to the academy. He genuinely believed there had to be better ways to solve problems, and he was willing to risk everything to find them. Zix, in turn, began sharing stories from their homeworld. They described how their farming communities handled disputes through council meetings where everyone spoke until they reached agreement. They explained the tradition of shared labor, where entire villages would work together to solve problems that no individual could handle alone. Most importantly, they talked about the philosophy of their people, that every conflict contained the seeds of its own solution. If you were patient enough to find them, these conversations happened during long walks through the academy's corridors, in quiet corners of the library, and sometimes late at night, when both of them couldn't sleep. They discovered that despite coming from completely different worlds, they shared a deep desire to find alternatives to violence and conflict. Their academic work began to reflect this partnership. When Professor Keth assigned research projects about military tactics, Zix and Alex would work together to analyze not just the effectiveness of different strategies, but also their long-term consequences. They studied how victories in battles sometimes created conditions for future conflicts, and how the most successful military leaders throughout history had often been those who knew when not to fight. Other students began to notice their collaboration and the unique perspectives they brought to class discussions. Alex's practical knowledge of combat operations combined with Zix's analytical approach to conflict resolution created insights that surprised even Professor Keth. Their presentations began to focus not just on how wars were fought, but on how they might have been prevented or resolved through other means. The semester's final project gave them the perfect opportunity to demonstrate what they had learned together. Students were required to choose a species and present a comprehensive analysis of their military capabilities. While most groups focused on weapons, technology, battle strategies, and victory statistics. But Zix and Alex decided to do something different. They chose to study humanity, but instead of just examining Earth's military history, they analyzed the parallel development of peacekeeping efforts, diplomatic solutions, and post-conflict reconstruction programs. Alex provided insider knowledge about how military operations actually worked, while Zix researched historical examples of successful peace, negotiations, and conflict prevention. Their presentation revealed a side of humanity that the class had never seen before. Yes, humans were skilled fighters who adapted quickly to new threats and challenges, but they were also innovators in areas like international law, humanitarian aid, and cooperative problem-solving. They had created organizations dedicated to preventing wars, systems for helping civilians caught in conflicts, and methods for rebuilding societies after violence had ended. Alex spoke about the psychological costs of constant warfare, describing how even the most successful military operations left lasting scars on everyone involved. He explained that the best soldiers were often those who understood that fighting should always be the last option, used only when all other possibilities had been exhausted. Zix analyzed the statistical effectiveness of different approaches too. Conflict resolution, showing how diplomatic solutions typically lasted longer and cost less than military victories. They presented case studies of situations where patient negotiation had resolved disputes that seemed impossible to fix through force alone. The presentation lasted over an hour, with other students asking questions that showed they were genuinely interested in these alternative approaches to conflict. Even Professor Keth seemed impressed by the depth of their research and the originality of their conclusions. But the most important moment came at the end, when another student asked whether humans would ever be able to move beyond their apparently violent nature. Alex and Zix exchanged a quick look before Alex answered, Every species in this room has the capacity for both violence and peace, he said carefully. Humans aren't unique in having conflicts, but we might be unique in how desperately we want to find better solutions. The fact that we keep trying, even after thousands of years of warfare, suggests that peace isn't just a dream for us. It's a goal we're actively working toward, Zix added. And that's why studying military history is so important. Not so we can become better at fighting, but so we can understand the true costs of violence and become more committed to preventing it. After the presentations were finished and grades had been posted, Zix and Alex found themselves back on the observation deck where they had first confronted the truth about Alex's identity. Both of them had received high marks for their project, and several professors had expressed interest in continuing their research as part of advanced peacekeeping studies. So what happens now? Zix asked, echoing the question they had posed weeks earlier, but with a completely different tone. This time, they weren't asking about whether Alex would be reported or discovered. They were asking about the future they might build together. Alex smiled, and for the first time since Zix had known him, expression looked completely natural and unguarded. Now we keep learning. I still have more to discover about how other species handle conflicts. And you've shown me that there are people in the galaxy who share my hope for better solutions. Zix felt their mandibles click in what their species considered a happy sound. I've learned that sometimes the most important allies come from the most unexpected places. Who would have thought that a peaceful farmer and a human warrior could find so much common ground? They stood together watching the stars, both of them thinking about the strange path that had brought them to this moment.
Oh.
Zix had come to the academy hoping to learn about peacekeeping and had ended up helping to hide the identity of one of Earth's most skilled soldiers. Alex had come seeking alternatives to violence and had found a friend who understood his dream of a less violent future. Neither of them knew that their collaboration would eventually lead to groundbreaking research in interspecies conflict resolution, or that their friendship would become a model for cooperation between very different civilizations. They only knew that they had found something rare and valuable, a partnership based on shared hopes rather than shared fears. As they prepared to return to their dormitories, Alex turned to Zix with a serious expression. "Thank you," he said simply, "for keeping my secret, for helping me learn, and for showing me that my dream of a more peaceful universe isn't impossible after all." Zix's response came from the heart. "Thank you for proving that even the most skilled warriors can be the strongest advocates for peace. Maybe that's the real lesson we both needed to learn."